It can be jarring when an otherwise smoothly controlled, genuinely terrific film lets a single duff scene slip through the cracks, enough that you have to wonder how the filmmakers involved fell so blatantly asleep at the wheel. These otherwise fantastic movies all whiffed it in a single scene. So I am Gareth, this is What Culture, and here are 10 terrible scenes from awesome recent movies. Number 10, Noriko survives Godzilla Minus One. Godzilla Minus One is assuredly the best Godzilla movie in many years. A thrilling and at times daring monster movie that invests the audience in its human characters, and it appears is not afraid to kill them off either. Case in point, the film's most shocking moment sees protagonist Koichi Shikishima's girlfriend Noriko seemingly perish when Godzilla unleashes his atomic breath upon Ginza, devastating the area. It's an impressively ballsy moment, but then an hour later at the end of the movie, it's revealed that Noriko inexplicably survived the attack with what appears to be relatively superficial injuries. What? Considering we literally saw Noriko get flung into the air by the strength of Godzilla's mighty blast, it's incredibly tough to believe that she'd managed to survive that, or at the very least not have debilitating, life-changing injuries. In a wonderful film that gets almost everything right, this sentimentally indulgent happy ending just strikes a bit of a sour note. Number 9, the AI interstitials. Late Night with the Devil. Late Night with the Devil is one of the most inventive and brilliantly executed horror films of the whole year, save for one misguided misstep it makes with regards to its use of AI-generated art. For the interstitial images of late-night talk show night owls, filmmakers Colin Carnes and Cameron Carnes turned to AI to help produce the images, as caused quite the online furore on the week of the movie's release. Notably, these interstitials weren't actually present in the original festival cut of the film. On one hand, there's the crassness of including soulless AI imagery in an otherwise meticulously crafted film, and then there's doing it in a period picture of all things where blatant AI art seems even more out of place. Even accepting Late Night with the Devil's evidently low budget, could the production really not have tossed a few $100 to an artist to produce this artwork instead of relying on automation? It's a worrying sign of the times, sadly. Now let's let out a big ol' sigh together, shall we? Alright, 1, 2, 3. Number 8, the Fury Road end credits montage. Furiosa, a Mad Max saga. Furiosa, a Mad Max saga may not reach the face-melting highs of Mad Max Fury Road, but it's still a well-crafted prequel from the great George Miller. It does make one head-scratching gaffe at the finish line though, as rather than let the film stand on its own 2 feet as the lead-in to Fury Road, the end credits are filled with clips from the superior previous movie. Considering that Furiosa was criticized both pre- and post-release for its noticeably greater use of CGI compared to Fury Road, the end credits montage only invited audiences to make that comparison. It was a really silly choice. As audiences sit there watching these credits, it's tough not to think, man, Fury Road did it so much better, didn't it? Even if Furiosa is by most metrics a rock-solid follow-up, the montage will surely encourage many to go and watch Fury Road again, albeit while lamenting that Furiosa just didn't quite hit the same level of production quality or intensity. What were they thinking here? Number 7, the tacked-on epilogue, The First Omen. The First Omen is one of the year's most pleasantly surprising films. A prequel to The Omen nobody really asked for, and yet it's a genuinely tense, visually enticing, brilliantly acted horror that's well worth your time. But what the hell was that final scene all about? After the movie quite perfectly leads into the start of the original film, an epilogue is tacked on in which protagonist Margaret, now living in seclusion in the mountains, is found by Father Brennan, who informs her that she will be hunted by the occult conspirators, and that her demonic son is called Damien. Yeah, I mean, we get it, it's setting up the Omen. This scene bashes the audience over the head with that fact after the story reaches its natural conclusion, and just feels like a reshoot mandated by a crusty studio exec who thought it somehow wasn't obvious enough what the prequel movie was setting up. But if you really didn't know that coming in, what were you even doing here? A single, corny, unforced error in an otherwise shockingly terrific film. Number 6, Christopher Walken's Emperor, Dune Part 2. Dune Part 2 is one of the best films of the whole damn year, which does actually make it tough to admit that Denis Villeneuve made one huge mistake in it. his aggressive miscasting of Christopher Walken as the villainous Emperor Shaddam IV. It was certainly an interesting choice on paper, but Walken's performance as the Emperor ultimately turned out to be the movie's most polarizing moment, with many feeling he failed to convey the heft of the iconic antagonist, some even going far enough to proclaim that he sleepwalked his way through the role. Now, in fairness to Walken, it is arguable that the Emperor isn't really supposed to live up to the statuesque hype, but all the same, there's a staggering lack of energy to the actor's work here, and the fact he's straight up talking with his distinctive Queen's twang doesn't really help much either. Oh no, a sandworm. As intriguing as Walken's casting was pre-release, ultimately he's just more of a distraction than a credit to the production. And Villeneuve probably would have been better off casting an actor who's less of a meme magnet and could have brought a bit more pep to the part. Number 5, I Am Become Death, Oppenheimer. Christopher Nolan's Best Picture-winning epic biopic Oppenheimer is an incredible cinematic achievement any way you slice it. Though, like most of Nolan's films, it's not without its unintentionally goofy moments. And by far the most infamous scene from Oppenheimer takes place early on, when Nolan decides to invoke the title character's iconic one-liner in a wholly unexpected context. Look, it was inevitable that Oppenheimer's I Am Become Death, Destroyer of Worlds quotation from the Hindu scripture Bhagavad Gita, which he quoted in an interview reflecting on the Trinity test, was going to be featured in the film. But did anyone expect it to show up during a sex scene? Mere seconds after Oppenheimer and Jean Tatlock stop their lovemaking, she grabs the Bhagavad Gita from his bookshelf and encourages him to read it. At which point he, speaks the line, and then the duo resume their amorous activities. It honestly feels like Nolan knew that he had to include the quote in the film, but didn't want to do it in the most obvious way possible. But why a sex scene? It comes off totally unnatural, even silly to shove the quote into the movie mid-coitus, and it's by far the worst, most distracting moment in an otherwise outstanding film. Number 4, The Cops Arrive, Strange Darling. J.T. Molnar's Strange Darling is one of the year's most buzzed about horror movies, and for damn good reason, revolving around a cat and mouse game between a cop, credited only as the Demon, and an infamous serial killer known as the Electric Lady. Some 20 minutes before the end of the movie, Molnar pulls the rug out by having the lady kill the Demon, biting his neck and causing him to bleed to death. Given that the Demon has already called for backup, however, 2 cops soon enough arrive, forcing the lady to restage the scene to make herself look like the victim. What follows is an embarrassingly on-the-nose scene in which the female cop, Gail, immediately believes the lady's ruse, while the male cop, Pete, is decidedly more skeptical. The 2 cops begin arguing, with Gail protesting that Pete won't listen to her because she, and I quote, has a vagina, even forgiving how lacking in subtlety the exchange is. Considering the subject matter and how Gail actually is wrong in this instance, it feels like a strangely off-key attempt to make light of the Me Too movement, capped by Pete calling her a dumb B-word in the next scene. Only he didn't say B-word. Now, there's nothing wrong with a horror movie about a female villain who preys on society's preconceptions of who is and isn't dangerous, but the whole cartoonish sequence with the cops feels like it was written by a decidedly less nuanced writer with some rather sketchy ideas about modern feminism. Number 3, The Campfire Chit-Chat, In a Violent Nature. Art house horror flick In a Violent Nature certainly is not for everyone, but it is a beautifully shot and quite daring provocation, taking a slow cinema approach to a typical Friday the 13th-esque slasher movie setup. Now, while the film primarily unfolds from the perspective of masked serial killer Johnny, there is actually a momentum-obliterating sequence early on that feels wholly at odds with that idea. In the first act, there's an almost 10-minute scene in which a group of friends, aka Johnny's various future victims, sit around a campfire, trade horrible comedic dialogue, and drop ham-fisted exposition about Johnny's backstory. Hell, it's so on the nose as to almost feel like a parody of similar scenes in conventional slasher flicks. And yet it also feels completely out of place in a film that otherwise has little time for lame humor or over-explaining things. If you were to just cut this scene out, or at least show only a fragment of it from Johnny's perspective, then the film instantly gets so much better. Maybe someone should have. Number 2, Get Away From Her, You B-word. Again, not B-word, Alien Romulus. Alien Romulus is, in many respects, a welcome welcome return to form for the hit sci-fi horror franchise. For while lacking the ambition of Ridley Scott's prequels Prometheus and Alien Covenant, it is very much a back-to-basics, meat-and-potatoes alien movie that gets a lot more right than it doesn't. But there is one moment that even the most permissive and do-eyed of fans struggle to swallow down. That cringeworthy, fan-serving line during the movie's intense climax. Yep, you know the one. When android Andy reappears to help protect surrogate sister Rain from a xenomorph, he shoots the alien before quipping, "Get away from her, you..." well, you know. Obviously, this is a nod to Ripley's very same one-liner from James Cameron's Aliens. But it feels so toe-curlingly forced here, so desperately pandering to fans of the franchise. Remember that better thing that we did 40 years ago? Please clap. Clap now. Number 1, the sanitized ending, Speak No Evil. The recent English-language remake of Danish-Dutch hit horror film Speak No Evil is, for the most part, an exceedingly well-executed retread that benefits enormously from the efforts of its central cast, especially a deliciously unhinged James McAvoy. It's just a shame that this remake couldn't commit to the courage of its inspiration's convictions, because as predictably as the sun rising in the east, a Hollywood redo of a controversial international horror hit ended up changing the original's bleak ending, because of course it did. Rather than conclude as the original does, with the serial killer couple Paddy and Kira killing their guests Louise and Ben, and taking their daughter Agnes for their own, the remake goes in a more cowardly, crowd-pleasing direction. The third act deviates significantly, with Louise and Ben making a frantic last stand against their captors, leading to Kira falling off the roof of her house to her death, before Paddy's kidnapped victim and faux son Ant beats him to death with a brick. Yeah, that'll do it. Despite the still visceral impact of this ending, it pales considerably compared to the bleaker finale of the original, doing the most predictable thing that any Hollywood remake of a grim horror hit possibly could.